The night her husband erased her from his life was the night Evelyn Thornton finally became visible again. She did not know she was homeless until the motel clerk stopped looking her in the eye. He did not raise his voice. He did not explain much. He only pointed to the notice taped to her door, and his finger trembled slightly, the way people's hands do when they are delivering news they would rather not carry payment due by morning. 5 words. Ordinary words. The kind printed on thousands of doors across the country every week. But for Evelyn, standing in the rain at 67 years old, with 3 cardboard boxes stacked against the wall of room 14, those 5 words were the last ones her old life would ever speak to her. She had $26 in her purse, a wedding ring mark still pale on her finger, and somewhere across town, in a house she had cleaned and paid for and filled with 42 years of family photographs, her ex-husband was sleeping beside a woman whose name Evelyn had learned only 3 months ago, not from a confession, but from a phone screen left face up on the kitchen counter, glowing in the dark like a small, careless fire that had already burned everything down before she smelled the smoke. The roof of that house did not leak. The porch light still worked. None of it belonged to her anymore. The night her husband erased her from his life was the night Evelyn Thornton finally became visible again. She did not know she was homeless until the motel clerk stopped looking her in the eye. He did not raise his voice. He did not explain much. He only pointed to the notice taped to her door, and his finger trembled slightly, the way people's hands do when they are delivering news they would rather not carry. Payment due by morning. 5 words. Ordinary words. The kind printed on thousands of doors across the country every week. But for Evelyn, standing in the rain at 67 years old, with 3 cardboard boxes stacked against the wall of room 14, those 5 words were the last ones her old life would ever speak to her. She had $26 in her purse, a wedding ring mark still pale on her finger, and somewhere across town, in a house she had cleaned and paid for, and filled with 42 years of family photographs. Her ex-husband was sleeping beside a woman whose name Evelyn had learned only 3 months ago, not from a confession, but from a phone screen left face up on the kitchen counter, glowing in the dark like a small, careless fire that had already burned everything down before she smelled the smoke. The roof of that house did not leak. The porch light still worked. The kitchen window still faced east the way Evelyn had loved, because morning light made coffee taste kinder. But none of that belonged to her anymore. Not the window, not the light, not even the memory of standing there with wet hands and a quiet heart, watching the sun find its way across the counter, the way it had for 4 decades, faithful to a room whose owner had not been. People in Briar Creek would later say Evelyn disappeared. But that was not accurate. A woman cannot disappear when no one has been watching her clearly enough to notice the moment she leaves. The notice on the motel door was only the last thing Evelyn read that night. The first betrayal had been signed months earlier, in handwriting she would have recognized anywhere. But standing in the rain with a paper grocery bag softening in her arms, she did not know that yet. She only knew the heater behind the curtain clicked like it was struggling to stay alive, and the carpet smelled of damp shoes and old bleach, and the coat dripping from the back of the chair had left a dark circle on the floor that slowly widened the way silence does when no one is coming to break it. On the small table beside the bed sat the groceries she had chosen with careful hands that afternoon. A half loaf of bread, 1 can of chicken noodle soup, instant coffee, a carton of eggs with 1 corner crushed where the bag had pressed against the car door. She had counted every dollar before buying them. Not because Evelyn had forgotten how to manage money. She had managed money her entire marriage. She had stretched paychecks across months that did not want to cooperate. She had clipped coupons on Sunday mornings while Gerald read the real estate section and drank coffee from the cup she placed on the second shelf each morning, because that was where his hand reached first. She had planned meals around what was marked down, made birthday cakes from scratch, because bakery cakes were for people who could afford not to measure flour twice, and once hosted a dinner for 8 of Gerald's clients, using a single chicken, 4 potatoes, and the kind of smile that made everyone believe the evening had been effortless. But now the numbers did not stretch. They only worn. Beside the bed were 3 cardboard boxes. That was what remained of the house where she had raised her son, hosted Christmas mornings, folded Gerald's shirts with the creases exactly where he liked them, and kept framed photographs dusted on the mantel, even when no one visited for months. 1 box held divorce papers. 1 held family pictures wrapped in newspaper so the glass would not crack. The last held small things no one else would have thought to save. Her mother's recipe cards, written in a cursive that leaned slightly left, the way her mother's posture had in her later years. A sewing tin with a faded picture of butter cookies on the lid. A pair of reading glasses. And an old wooden handle brush she had once used to clean dust from carved furniture, back when her hands still remembered what they were made for. Evelyn picked up the brush. For a moment, her fingers wrapped around the handle the way they had 30 years ago, and something shifted inside her chest. Not hope. Hope was too large a word for a motel room with a payment notice on the door. Something smaller, a muscle memory that had outlasted everything else. She opened the manila folder on the bed. The property settlement sat on top its pages, slightly curled from being read and reread in different rooms across different weeks. She had looked at these documents before. But fear has a way of blurring the details until the mind is ready to absorb what the heart already suspects. This time, 1 line stopped her. A date. Not from the week Gerald said he was leaving. Not from the month he first mentioned wanting something different. The date was from spring, late April. Back when Evelyn was still kneeling in the garden bed, behind the kitchen window pressing tomato seedlings into soil she had turned by hand. Back when she was still washing his coffee cup each morning. Back when she still believed they were growing old in the same house, on the same porch, watching the same maple tree turn amber every October, the way it had for 42 autumns. But on that April date, Gerald had already contacted a property appraiser. He had already requested a market valuation. He had already begun the arithmetic of dividing a life he had not yet told Evelyn he intended to leave. Her hand tightened on the page. The paper bent slightly beneath her thumb, and she noticed absurdly that her nail was still clean, as if the body could maintain small dignities while the mind absorbed a wound this size. Gerald had not made a sudden mistake. He had not fallen into confusion or been swept away by some midlife recklessness he would later regret in the way country songs promise men do. He had made arrangements, quiet ones, legal ones, the kind that require signatures and dates, and the particular calm of a man who has already decided to leave but wants the math to work out before the conversation begins. And Evelyn, the woman who had kept that house alive for 4 decades, had been the last person invited into the truth of its ending. But the April date was not the worst of it. Evelyn turned the page. Her fingers moved to a section she had skimmed before, without understanding a section written in the careful, bloodless language of property law, the kind of language designed to make enormous things sound administrative. 2 investment properties were listed. Not the family home. 2 others. A duplex near the old highway and a small commercial lot on Ridgeway Street. Both listed as transferred 6 months before the divorce was filed. Evelyn read the paragraph twice, then a 3rd time. The words did not change. She had never known about the duplex. She had never heard of the lot on Ridgeway. But both had been purchased under a joint trust established early in the marriage. A trust Gerald had managed because he was the one who understood real estate, because he was the one whose name belonged on documents, because Evelyn had believed the way women of her generation were taught to believe that trusting your husband with the finances was the same as trusting your husband with your life. Both properties had been sold. The proceeds had been deposited into an account Evelyn had never seen, and both transfers carried a single signature of authorization, a power of attorney Evelyn had signed in 2016 in their kitchen on a Tuesday evening, while Gerald explained it was a standard insurance form, and Evelyn signed where his finger pointed because dinner was on the stove, and their grandson was calling on the phone, and she had spent 40 years signing whatever Gerald placed in front of her, the way a river follows a channel it did not choose. She had not been abandoned. She had been financially dismantled piece by piece by a man who planned his exit the way he planned his open houses, with preparation, with paperwork, with the steady confidence of someone who believed the property was already his before the offer was made. Evelyn sat very still. The heater clicked. Rain ran down the motel window in lines that bent and merged and disappeared. Her hands lay flat on the documents the way hands lay flat on a table. when the body needs to feel something solid beneath a truth that has no floor. She did not cry. She had done her crying weeks ago in a library bathroom with the faucet running so no one outside would hear. What moved through her now was not grief. It was the particular coldness that arrives when a woman realizes she was not betrayed in a moment of weakness. She was betrayed in a season of planning by a man who had time to think, time to reconsider, time to choose differently, and chose this. Outside, rain tapped against the motel window in a rhythm that almost sounded patient. The notice waited in her purse. By morning, she would have to leave this room too. But before she could figure out where she was going, she needed to sit with what she now understood. That the life she had built with both hands had been taken apart, one quiet signature at a time, by the man who had promised in a church in Lexington in front of people who brought casserole dishes as wedding gifts to build it with her. Evelyn placed the key to their old house on the motel nightstand. She had carried it for weeks. It was useless now. The locks had been changed. The rooms had been emptied by a moving company Gerald hired while she was at a doctor's appointment, but she could not throw the key away. Not because she believed it would ever open that door again. Because letting go of it felt like admitting that 42 years could fit inside something small enough to disappear between coins and receipts at the bottom of a handbag. The key sat on the nightstand beneath the lamp, and it did not shine. It just waited there the way Evelyn waited for what neither of them knew yet. Before Gerald's career, before the dinner parties, before she became the woman who remembered everyone else's needs and never once asked the room to remember hers, there had been a shop. A small furniture repair shop near Lexington, where a younger Evelyn had worked with varnish under her nails and sawdust on her sleeves, and a notebook full of sketches she believed would one day become real. Rocking chairs with curved arms that fit the human palm, side tables with hand-cut joinery, a cabinet with glass doors she designed during her lunch break, drawing the lines slowly because she wanted to get the proportions right, the way a person writes a letter to someone they love, not quickly, but well. And on the first page, written in pencil, she never erased a name for the business she planned to build. Thornton Restorations. It was not a fantasy. It was a plan. The kind young women make before the world teaches them that plans belong to other people. Then Gerald's real estate career moved faster than either of them expected, and the shape of Evelyn's days changed the way water changes when someone drops a stone into it. First came evening phone calls she learned not to interrupt. Then weekend open houses she learned to attend in pressed dresses with a smile that said, "This man is trustworthy. Look how well his wife holds a glass of wine." Then client dinners in their own dining room where Evelyn remembered the names Gerald forgot, set flowers on the table when the budget said no, and cooked for men who praised the warmth of the home without once asking who created it. She told herself it was partnership. Gerald was building something. She was helping him build it. The shop could wait. Then Brennan was born, and the word wait grew roots. Bottles at midnight. School forms signed at the kitchen counter. Doctor visits where she sat alone because Gerald was showing a property. Birthday cakes with crooked frosting and candles that never matched. Lost shoes found behind the dryer. Laundry folded after everyone else was asleep because the sound of the machine bothered Gerald when he was reviewing contracts. The repair shop became weekend work, then occasional work, then something she would get back to later. Later became the most dangerous word in Evelyn's vocabulary. Later, when Gerald's career settles. Later, when Brennan starts school. Later, when the mortgage feels lighter. Later, when everyone needs less from her. But everyone never needed less. They only became accustomed to her giving more. Her tools migrated from the kitchen table to the laundry room shelf. From the shelf to a box in the garage. From the garage to a space behind Christmas decorations and old paint cans where no one looked unless they needed a Phillips head screwdriver. No one told her to stop. That would have been something she could fight. Instead, life simply kept needing dinner, clean towels, a calm voice at midnight when Brennan had a fever, a birthday remembered for a neighbor, a problem solved quietly before anyone else noticed it existed. And Evelyn became so good at holding everything together that people stopped seeing the hands doing the holding. By the third month after leaving, Evelyn's savings had thinned to a number she checked every morning and regretted every night. She learned which grocery stores marked down bread near closing, which motel lobbies kept coffee out past breakfast, which library branches stayed open latest and had the softest chairs near the heat vents. She washed clothes in motel sinks and dried them on the shower rod and packed them back into the same box each time she moved, because unpacking would mean she had stopped moving, and stopping meant admitting she had nowhere left to go. Her phone lay face down on whatever surface was nearest. Brennan called every Sunday from Oregon, and Evelyn let it ring once before answering, using that single ring to arrange her voice into the shape of a woman who was doing all right. His voice always carried the sound of his life happening around him. A cabinet closing, his wife asking someone about homework, a child laughing at something Evelyn could not see. He would ask if she was okay. He always asked. And Evelyn would say what she always said. "I am doing all right, sweetheart." She said it like a mother protecting her son from weather he could not control. Not like a woman who might not have a room tomorrow. Because if she told Brennan the truth, he would come. And if he came, his wife would rearrange the guest room with that particular kind of hospitality that is generous and cautious at the same time. His children would grow quiet around her. Dinner would feel careful. And Evelyn would become the thing she feared most, an emergency someone else had to manage. Or maybe if she was being honest in the way only a dark motel room at midnight allows, she needed one person left on earth who still believed she was not falling apart. One afternoon, rain began while she was inside the county library near Briar Creek. Evelyn sat near the back with a gardening book open on her lap, though she had not turned the page in 20 minutes. The words blurred and reassembled and blurred again, not because her eyes were weak, but because her mind was somewhere else entirely. Across the room, a grandfather sat with his granddaughter on his knee, helping her sound out a word she could not quite reach. The girl pointed at the page. The old man leaned close. He did not correct her. He waited. And when she found the word herself, his hand rested briefly on her hair, the way hands do when love does not need to explain itself. Evelyn looked down before anyone could see her face change. She did not miss Gerald. That part had begun to loosen the way a bandage loosens when the wound beneath it has finally dried. But she missed belonging somewhere without having to explain why she was there. She missed being a person in a room who did not need a reason to sit down. When the library closed, she walked to her old Buick in the parking lot. The back seat held her boxes beneath a blanket. The gas needle hovered near the orange. On the passenger seat was a county map she had taken from a rack near the front desk, the kind printed on thin paper with fold lines already softening from use. She meant to drive back toward the cheapest motel. She had been calculating the route all afternoon, measuring distance against the money in her wallet, the way a sailor measures wind against the weight of the boat. But her eyes caught a line on the map she had not noticed before. A thin gray road east of Briar Creek. No town name beside it. No church. No gas station. Just a service road curving into the hills and stopping at a small rectangle marked with 2 words. Quarry closed. Evelyn stared at the map for a long time. Rain ran down the windshield in lines that bent and merged and disappeared. Then she started the engine and turned east. The pavement narrowed within minutes. Trees leaned close enough to brush the mirrors, and the headlights caught only wet bark and dark leaves and the faint reflection of animal eyes that vanished before Evelyn could name what they belonged to. Then, through the brush, she saw a rusted gate hanging crooked from one hinge. Beside it, an old sign had faded almost to white. She stopped the car and let the engine idle while she read the words that were left. Fenton Quarry. Closed. Every door for 3 months had told Evelyn the same thing. You cannot stay. But this one, this forgotten one, hung open. She pulled forward slowly, and the gate did not resist. That was the first thing that unsettled her. Something that old and rusted should have protested, should have scraped against the gravel or groaned on its hinge the way things do when they have been left alone too long and forgotten how to welcome anyone. But the gate only moved under the weight of her hand, as if it had been waiting for someone who would not demand it look presentable first. The quarry appeared all at once, not gradually the way towns reveal themselves, all at once the way wounds do. Tall limestone walls rose on 3 sides, pale and streaked with dark rainwater. At the bottom, shallow pools reflected a sky the color of old silver. Rusted equipment foundations sat beneath vines. Young trees had grown through cracks where trucks must have passed daily 30 years ago. The silence was enormous. No highway noise, no motel television bleeding through thin walls. only rain falling into stone and the engine of Evelyn's Buick ticking as it cooled. Near the back wall, partly hidden behind sycamore trees whose bark peeled in long, pale strips, she saw the cabin. It was smaller than anything she had imagined calling shelter. A narrow wooden structure with a sagging porch, a rusted metal roof, 2 front windows clouded with grime, thick enough to erase whatever was behind them. 1 shutter hung loose. Moss darkened the steps. A stovepipe leaned from one side at an angle that suggested it had survived years of wind by stubbornness rather than engineering. Evelyn parked several yards away and sat with both hands on the steering wheel. The cabin did not look welcoming. It did not look safe. It looked the way she felt, tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep and everything to do with being expected to hold a shape that no longer fit. She stepped out into the rain. The porch board dipped under her left foot. She froze, listened. Nothing moved inside. The front door had swollen from weather and age, and Evelyn had to press her shoulder against it twice before it gave way with a soft crack, like old wood finally releasing a breath it had held too long. The smell met her first. Dust, mildew, cold ashes, and beneath all of it, something dry and patient, like timber that had been waiting years for warmth. The main room was nearly bare. A cast-iron stove sat against the far wall, its door slightly ajar. A cracked chair lay on its side in the corner. There was a kitchen area with stained cabinets and a sink that coughed out nothing when she turned the handle. In the next room, a narrow bed frame without a mattress. A bathroom with a rusted faucet, a cracked mirror, and a floor that sagged near the tub. Above her, water dripped into a tin pot someone had placed beneath the leak long ago. The drip was steady, unhurried, almost musical if Evelyn held still long enough to let her breathing match it. She walked back into the main room and stopped. Against the far wall, pushed into shadow, was a table. Heavy, dark, warped along one edge with deep scars across its surface, burn rings from old cups, knife marks, scratches that told of decades of use by hands that had not been gentle. Most people would have seen junk. Evelyn saw walnut. She crossed the room before her mind gave permission. Her palm found the surface. She brushed dust away with the heel of her hand slowly, the way she had once cleaned furniture in the shop near Lexington when she was 23, and believed that damaged things were only waiting for someone patient enough to ask them what they still had left. The grain was still there, faint, buried, running in long, dark lines beneath the filth, the way rivers run beneath ice in winter. Not gone, not ruined, just unseen. The way Evelyn had been unseen. The way the cabin itself had been unseen. The way certain lives go unnoticed until someone arrives who knows how to look without flinching at what time has done. Her fingers traced a deep gouge near the table's edge. She did not know who had made it. She did not know whose coffee had left the dark ring beside her thumb. She did not know whose weight had worn the surface smooth in one spot and rough in another. But she recognized the table the way one wounded thing recognizes another, not with pity, but with the quiet understanding that survival is its own kind of beauty. She whispered, without meaning to, "You and me both." The rain picked up outside. Water tapped through the roof into the tin pot, and the sound filled the cabin with the rhythm that was not comfort exactly, but was close enough to keep. Evelyn stood alone in that broken room with her hand on a table no one had cared about in years. And for the first time since the motel, since the papers, since the April date that proved her life had been sold before she was told it was for sale, the silence around her did not feel like rejection. It felt like room. She only meant to stay until the rain stopped. That was the sensible plan, and Evelyn was above all else a sensible woman. Sensible women did not sleep in quarries. Sensible women called their sons. Sensible women found shelters with proper doors and people who asked your name and wrote it on a clipboard. But Sensible had kept Evelyn invisible for 42 years. Sensible had folded Gerald's shirts. Sensible had smiled at dinner guests. Sensible had put her own notebook in a box behind Christmas decorations and never once shouted that the box was getting heavier. Evening filled the quarry early. The limestone walls swallowed the light the way deep water swallows sound. And by the time Evelyn returned to the porch, the road behind her had disappeared into the trees. She went back to the Buick, pulled the blanket from the back seat, sat in the driver's seat with the door cracked open, listening to rain fall around the cabin. She had no right to stay, and no reason to leave. Before sleeping, she reached into her purse and took out the old house key. She held it in her palm for a long moment. Then she walked through the rain to the cabin door and set the key on the walnut table beside the burn rings and the knife marks and the decades of use that no one had bothered to honor. A useless key on a forgotten table. Two things the world had discarded sitting together in the dark, waiting to find out if they still mattered. By morning, the cabin was not quiet. It creaked. It settled. It clicked when wind moved through the broken window frame the way an old dog shifts in sleep. Not alarmed, just reminding the room it was still breathing. Evelyn woke in the Buick with a stiff neck and cold fingers and the particular confusion of a woman who opens her eyes expecting a ceiling and finds a windshield instead. The quarry looked different under pale light. The limestone walls had lost their menace and turned the color of old bone. Shallow pools at the base caught the sky and held it still. For a moment, the whole place looked like something that had once been important and was now resting between uses. And Evelyn thought that was a generous way to describe abandonment, until she realized she was also describing herself. She stepped out of the car. The cabin waited across the wet ground with its sagging porch and rusted roof, and the patience of something that had stopped expecting visitors years ago, but had not yet given up on the idea entirely. Inside, the dark stain on the ceiling near the stove had spread overnight. One corner of the front step had softened enough that her heel nearly went through it. The tin pot beneath the leak was full. Evelyn emptied it and set it back. Then she made a decision that sounded small enough to be harmless. She would not call this home. She would only make it safe enough for one more night. She drove into Briar Creek on fumes and spent $23 at a hardware store with wooden floors and a bell above the door that rang with the tired cheerfulness of something that had been announcing arrivals for decades. She bought duct tape, a blue-tip box of matches, a cheap tarp, 2 cans of soup, and a packet of nails she studied for a long time before choosing. Because choosing wrong when you have $11 left is not a mistake you recover from quickly. The clerk looked at her muddy shoes, then at the tarp. His eyes moved the way small town eyes do when they are calculating how much to ask. Storm damage. Evelyn nodded. It was not exactly a lie. Every kind of storm leaves damage. Some just take longer to notice. Back at the quarry, she swept the main room until dust rose in gray clouds that turned the light inside the cabin the color of old photographs. She taped plastic over the cracked window. She dragged rotten cardboard and broken boards outside and stacked them near the tree line because even a place this neglected deserved the dignity of order. By late afternoon, her shoulders burned, and her lower back had begun the low protest it had started making sometime after 60. She opened a can of chicken noodle soup and tried the wood stove. The first smoke came back into the room so fast, it felt personal. Evelyn stumbled outside, coughing, one hand pressed against her chest, the other still holding the bent lid of the soup can because her mind had not yet caught up with her lungs. She stood on the porch with tears streaming from the smoke and watched gray clouds pour through the cabin doorway like the stove had been holding its breath for years and had finally decided to exhale everything at once. That was when she heard the truck. Not close at first. A low grind of engine somewhere beyond the trees, moving with the unhurried confidence of someone who knew every washed-out turn and did not need pavement to feel certain. The sound grew until a faded blue pickup appeared on the quarry road, its bed loaded with scrap lumber, its windshield cracked along the passenger side in a line so old it had turned white. The truck stopped several yards from the cabin. An old man stepped out. He wore a canvas jacket the color of creek mud work boots, with laces that did not match, and a cap darkened by so many seasons of weather, it no longer had an original color. His beard was white along the jaw and trimmed short, the way men trim beards when they have no one to impress but still believe in keeping things even. In one hand, he carried a metal toolbox that swung with the weight of objects that had spent decades being useful. He looked at the smoking doorway, then at Evelyn, then at the tarp folded near the steps. His voice came dry and level, the way a fence post would sound if fence posts could talk. You trying to heat that cabin or smoke yourself like a Virginia ham? Evelyn should have been embarrassed. The smoke was still drifting from the door. Her eyes were red. Her coat was dusted with ash. But she was too tired to perform the kind of polished composure she had practiced for 42 years of dinner parties, and something about the old man's voice made pretending feel unnecessary. I thought the stove would work. It might, if the pipe ain't packed full of bird nests and 20 years of regret. He looked up at the leaning stovepipe and squinted as if the diagnosis was visible from the ground. Name's Cal Jessup. Worked this quarry 30 years before they shut it down and pretended the stone ran out. It didn't run out. The money did. Stone's still here. Stone's always here. Evelyn tightened her grip on the porch rail. I am not trying to cause trouble. Cal studied her face for a moment. Not the way people stare when they want gossip or when they are assembling a story to tell later at a counter somewhere. More like he was measuring how much weight a person was carrying before deciding whether to offer a hand or a chair. His words came after a pause that felt deliberate. Trouble usually gets here before folks do. Then he opened the toolbox. He did not ask why she was there. He did not ask how long she planned to stay. He did not ask about the Buick with the boxes in the back seat, or the tarp she had bought with money she probably could not spare. That silence was the first kindness, and Evelyn received it the way parched ground receives rain, without comment, but completely. What Evelyn did not know, not yet, not until much later, was that Cal Jessup had not stumbled upon the quarry by accident. He lived 2 miles east in a house he had owned since his wife passed 11 years ago, a house close enough to hear an engine on the quarry road, if the wind was right and the night was still. He had been listening to that road for 15 years, not guarding it exactly, more like attending it the way a man attends a grave he visits not out of obligation, but out of a debt he cannot name aloud. Cal had a reason for watching. He had a reason for coming when he heard Evelyn's Buick on the gravel. And the reason sat somewhere deep in his chest beneath 30 years of silence and a signature he had never been able to forget. But that truth would wait. For now he cleared the stovepipe. He pulled out a nest packed with twigs, feathers, dry leaves, and a layer of soot so dense it crumbled in his hands like dark chalk. He showed Evelyn the nest before tossing it into the weeds, and his voice carried the patience of a man who had long ago decided that showing was more useful than telling. Fire don't forgive guessing. You learn that fast out here, or you learn it the hard way, which is the same thing, but with less eyebrows. He made her watch as he checked the draft, adjusted the stove door, fed the first small fire with kindling he split from a scrap board using the back of a hatchet he pulled from the toolbox as casually as another man might pull out a pen. The fire caught. Smoke rose through the pipe and out into the quarry air in a thin gray line, and for the first time the cabin smelled like warmth rather than memory. Then Cal handed Evelyn the brush from the stovepipe kit. Your turn. She stared at it. My turn. If you are staying even one more night, your hands need to know what keeps you alive. That sentence did not comfort her. It settled into her the way a nail settles into wood, with resistance first and then a hold that would not let go. For the next hour, Cal showed her which porch boards could not be trusted, how to brace the broken step using a piece of oak from his truck bed, and where rain was entering beneath the roof metal along the eastern seam. He demonstrated each repair once. Then he waited while Evelyn tried. Her first nail bent sideways. She looked at Cal. He said nothing. Her second went in crooked and the board shifted. He still said nothing. He simply watched the way an old dog watches a puppy try to carry a stick that is twice its length. Not judging, just present. By the fifth nail the board held. It was not beautiful. The nail head sat slightly raised, and the board was a 1/4 inch off true. But it held. Evelyn looked at it longer than the repair deserved. It was only one board, but it was the first thing she had fixed for herself in longer than she could remember, and the feeling that passed through her was not pride exactly. It was closer to the feeling of hearing your own name spoken aloud after a long time in a place where no one knows it. Before leaving, Cal stood beside his truck and looked back at the cabin the way a man looks at a photograph of a place he once knew. His voice dropped half a register. Folks in town think this place belongs to nobody. That ain't exactly true. Evelyn's stomach tightened. Who owns it? Cal's eyes moved toward the far quarry wall where vines covered a concrete foundation so completely it looked like the earth was trying to swallow something it did not want to remember. That's the question. Been the question for a long time. He reached into his coat pocket and handed her a small folded paper with a phone number written in pencil that had been sharpened with a knife. If that stove acts up again, call before you do something heroic. He climbed into the truck, and the engine turned over with the sound of metal that had been starting and stopping for 30 years, and saw no reason to change the arrangement. Evelyn stood in the fading light with the paper in one hand and the hammer in the other. And the cabin behind her felt different now. Not safe, not hers, but no longer just a place where she was hiding. More like a place that had its own questions and had been waiting for someone willing to ask them. She began with the table. For 3 days after Cal left, Evelyn told herself there were more important repairs. The roof seam, the second window, the porch rail that wobbled when she leaned against it. But each time she crossed the main room, her eyes returned to the walnut table against the wall. Its broken leg, its blackened surface, the deep scars that made it look like something the quarry had chewed up and spit out. She pulled it towards the window on the 4th morning, where the light was strong enough to show her what needed fixing first. The broken leg joint, the warped edge along the back, the split near the center that had widened over years of damp and neglect. She had already cleaned the surface during her first nights in the cabin. Now came the harder work. The work that required measuring and cutting, and the particular courage of a woman who had not held a saw in 30 years, and was no longer certain her hands remembered the conversation between blade and wood. Her first serious mistake arrived quickly. She cut the replacement brace too short. The second piece split when she drove the nail too hard, and the sound of the wood cracking open made her flinch not at the volume, but at the reminder that something she was trying to hold together had just come apart. The third piece fit badly. The table rocked worse than before. Evelyn sat back on her heels and stared at it. Shame arrived fast, the way it always did. The voice she had carried for decades, the one that sounded like practicality, but was actually fear, whispered the things it always whispered. That she had waited too long. That whatever skill she once had was gone. That a woman who could not keep her marriage or her house or even a motel room had no business pretending she could restore anything at all. Then a drop of water landed in the tin pot near the stove. The sound pulled her back. One drop, then another. Small, steady, ordinary. The pot did not care whether Evelyn believed in herself. The leak did not stop because she was discouraged. The cabin simply went on being broken in its patient way. And somewhere inside that patience, Evelyn found enough room to pick up the brace again. She measured twice, cut once, waited 3 full breaths before hammering. The joint held, not perfectly, but the table stood, and when she pressed her palm against the surface, nothing moved. Over the next week, she sanded carefully, stopping before the scars disappeared. Because the scars were not damage, they were evidence. She filled the deepest split with wood filler and smoothed it flush. She cleaned the joints. She rubbed oil into the surface until the walnut warmed beneath her hand, the way skin warms when someone finally touches it after a long time alone. She did not make the table look new. New would have been a lie. She made it honest. When Cal returned 3 days later with a bag of roofing nails and a look on his face that suggested checking on Evelyn was becoming a habit he had not planned on, he stepped inside the cabin and stopped. He removed his cap. He ran one rough hand across the table surface, the way a man touches something he is not sure he has the right to touch. Evelyn waited. She had not realized how badly she wanted him to speak until the silence stretched long enough to frighten her. Cal nodded slowly. Quarrymen ate lunch on this table for years. Coffee, cards, pay envelopes, bad news, good news, all of it. He looked at her. You left the marks. I thought they belonged there. They do. 2 words. Evelyn carried them for days the way she had once carried the house key, except these were not useless. These opened something. A week later, Evelyn drove into Briar Creek for supplies and stopped at Marsh's Griddle because the rain had returned and the diner was warm, and she had learned that warmth was worth more than pride when your bones ached and your hands smelled of linseed oil. The place was small. Red vinyl booths, fogged windows, the smell of bacon grease so deep in the walls it had probably become structural. A chalkboard above the register listed the day's pie in handwriting that had given up on neatness years ago and settled for legibility the way old diners settle for honesty instead of charm. The woman behind the counter had a face built for efficiency and a voice that managed to be kind without being soft. Dottie Marsh had owned this diner since her husband passed 14 years ago, and she ran it the way certain women run things, not loudly, but so completely that removing her would cause the whole structure to lean. She had seen Evelyn before, buying sandpaper at the hardware store, filling a water jug at the gas station. Existing in Briar Creek the way certain people exist in small towns present, but unexplained. This time, Dottie's eyes moved to Evelyn's hands. Sawdust sat in the creases of her knuckles. A thin line of oil darkened the edge of one nail. A small cut, half-healed, crossed her left thumb, where a chisel had slipped during the table work. Dottie's voice was casual, but her eyes were not. "You work with wood." Evelyn looked down at her hands as if they belonged to someone she was only beginning to recognize. A little. Dottie tilted her head toward a small table near the front window. One leg had been wrapped in silver duct tape. A stack of menus leaned against it to keep it steady, and the whole arrangement had the resigned look of something that had been waiting for real help while making do with whatever was available. "My brother keeps saying he will fix that. He has been saying it since Easter." Easter was 7 months ago. The word no reached Evelyn's tongue out of habit. She had spent decades deflecting her own abilities the way modest women do not, because they lack confidence, but because they have been trained to believe that offering too much makes them inconvenient. But the table by the window looked the way the walnut table had looked before Evelyn's hands found it. Tired, overlooked, waiting. I could look at it. Not a promise, not confidence, just a door cracked open wide enough for air to pass through. 2 days later, Dottie let her take the table. Evelyn loaded it into the back of the Buick with a blanket beneath it so the finish would not scratch against the trunk floor, and she drove it to the quarry the way a person carries something fragile through a crowd. Not fast, but aware of every bump and turn. She repaired it in the cabin, working slowly, sanding away the sticky film of years, tightening the weak leg, polishing the top until the wood stopped looking embarrassed under the light. She reinforced the joints with small oak dowels she shaped by hand from scrap Cal had left in the truck bed on his last visit. The work took 2 days. Not because the repair was complicated, but because Evelyn kept stopping to check, to press, to make sure the thing she was building would hold weight honestly, the way she wished someone had checked whether she could hold the weight she had been carrying for 42 years. When she returned the table to Marcia's griddle, Dottie set it near the window and taped a small handwritten card to the edge. Restored by E. Thornton. Evelyn stared at the card. Her name looked strange out in the open. For over a year it had existed only on legal documents and motel registers, places where names are recorded but not remembered. Now it sat on a table in a window where people passing on the sidewalk could read it without knowing anything about the woman it belonged to. Except that she had made something broken hold weight again. The next morning, Dottie called Cal's number because Evelyn had no steady phone signal at the quarry. A customer wanted to buy the table. Evelyn drove to town, telling herself not to expect much, because expecting much was how a person got flattened, and she had been flattened enough for several lifetimes. Dottie handed her $80 in folded bills. Evelyn held the money in both hands. It was not enough to change her life. It would not pay a month's rent anywhere. It would not bring back the house or undo the signatures, or make Gerald feel what he should have felt before he called Renee by her first name in a tone Evelyn had not heard directed at her in 15 years. But it was the first money Evelyn had earned with her own hands in longer than she could remember. Not alimony, not settlement, not survival arithmetic. This had come from skill she thought she had lost. Applied to wood she thought was finished in a place everyone else had forgotten. Dottie watched her from behind the counter. People asked who made it. I told them, E. Thornton. Evelyn looked at the empty spot by the window where the table had stood. For months she had been trying to remain invisible. Now her name sat in a diner window in a town she had not chosen, and strangers were speaking it to each other over coffee. Names have a way of traveling in small towns carried by the same currents that carry weather and gossip and the slow, reliable movement of people who drive the same roads every day. Within 2 weeks, a woman brought Evelyn a rocking chair with a cracked spindle. Then a man appeared at Marsh's griddle, asking if E. Thornton could look at a bookcase his wife refused to throw away. Then a church deacon left a note with Dottie about a set of pew ends that had been removed during renovation and were sitting in a shed behind the fellowship hall, waiting for someone who understood that old wood does not stop being sacred just because the building changes shape. Evelyn said yes to each one, not eagerly, carefully. The way a person steps onto ice testing the surface before committing weight. She worked in the cabin with the door open when the weather allowed, and the quarry filled with sounds it had not heard in years. The rasp of sandpaper, the tap of a mallet, the particular silence that happens when a woman holds a piece of wood up to the light and turns it slowly, reading the grain the way another person might read a letter from someone they loved. She did not erase the scars. She never erased the scars. She only made the wood strong enough to carry them honestly. On a cold Tuesday in late autumn, while pulling loose boards from beneath the kitchen cabinet to check for rot, Evelyn felt one floorboard lift differently from the others. It rose too easily at one end, as if someone had pried it up before and set it back in a hurry. The way people handle things they want to hide, but also want to find again someday. She set down the pry bar. The cabin was quiet. Outside, dry leaves scraped across the porch in the wind, and the sound was so much like whispered conversation that Evelyn almost looked toward the door. Under the board was a narrow space packed with dust and mouse droppings and something wrapped in oilcloth so old it cracked when she touched it. She reached in carefully. The bundle came loose with a soft tear. Inside were folded papers, a stained map of the quarry property, a rusted key, and a small notebook, its leather cover darkened to the color of old tobacco. Its spine cracked, but still holding. Evelyn set the key on the walnut table. It was heavier than the house key she had carried for months. Darker, older. The kind of key that belonged to a lock built in a time when locks were made to last longer than the people who used them. The two keys sat together on the restored surface like sentences from different chapters of the same story. She opened the notebook. The handwriting inside was small and precise, written in pencil that had faded to the color of winter grass, but remained legible on most pages. Dates ran along the margins. The earliest entry she could read was from April 1943. The name on the inside cover, printed in block letters by a hand that pressed hard enough to leave grooves in the paper, was Ada Weeks. Evelyn turned the pages slowly. Ada had written the way people write when no one else is listening. Not for an audience, not for history, for herself. For proof, perhaps, that the days she spent alone in this quarry were real, that the work she did mattered, that someone, even if only her own future self, would someday read these words and know that a woman had been here, that she had not been nothing. The entries were practical at first: weather reports, equipment checks, water levels at the quarry floor, notes about which road sections needed grading after storms, which machine housings needed grease, which fence posts had shifted in the freeze. Ada wrote about these things with the precision of someone who understood that the quarry could not care for itself, and no one else was coming to do it. The men had gone to war. Most of the men, anyway. The ones who stayed were old or injured or bound to the town by circumstances they did not discuss. Ada's husband, Elmer, had shipped out in early 43. He did not come home. The notebook did not record his death directly. There was simply an entry in November 1944 that read, "Letter came today." Set it on the table. Walked to the quarry. Checked the east pump. Came back. Read it again. After that, the entries changed. They grew longer, more detailed, as if Ada, having lost the person she spoke to at the end of each day, had decided the notebook would have to do. She wrote about repairing the cabin roof after an ice storm, about replacing a cracked valve on the water line by hand, using a wrench she had to modify because it was built for a grip wider than hers. About the company men who came twice a year to inspect the quarry and looked past her the way people look past fence posts, acknowledging the function, never the object. And she wrote about the cabin. This place was deeded to whoever kept it alive. That is what Mr. Fenton said when I came. Caretaker parcel, he called it. The cabin and the spring and the road to the gate. Not the quarry. The quarry belongs to the company. But this piece belongs to whoever stays. Evelyn read that passage 3 times. Then she closed the notebook and held it against her chest the way a person holds something that has just changed the weight of the room. The map was hand-drawn, its edges brown with age. Most of the writing had faded beyond reading, but one section remained clear. A line had been drawn around the cabin, the spring path behind it, and a narrow strip leading toward the old service road. Not the whole quarry, just this piece. And beside the outline, written in black pencil by a hand that pressed hard enough to leave grooves in the paper, were 2 words: caretaker parcel. Evelyn did not understand the legal weight of those words, but her body understood something her mind had not yet assembled, because her hands had gone completely still. and Evelyn's hands only went still when they recognized that what they were holding mattered more than what they were feeling. The next morning, Evelyn drove to the county records office wearing her best sweater and carrying the papers in a folder tied with kitchen string. The woman behind the counter had the polite, measured smile people use when they believe an older person has wandered into the wrong office with the wrong question. Evelyn explained the quarry, the cabin, the map, the phrase caretaker parcel. The woman typed, frowned, disappeared into a back room. When she returned, the smile was gone. Something had replaced it, not hostility, but the careful blankness of a person who has just encountered information that belongs to someone else's problem. There was a request made on this property 2 weeks ago. Evelyn felt her fingers tighten around the folder until the kitchen string pressed a line into her palm. By who? I cannot give you that information. Evelyn sat in the Buick in the parking lot with the map on her lap and the engine off. 2 weeks ago, she had barely begun fixing the porch. She had not yet repaired the table. She had not yet heard her name spoken aloud in Marcia's griddle by a woman she barely knew. 2 weeks ago, Evelyn was invisible. But someone had already been looking at the ground beneath her feet. She started the engine and was about to pull out when she saw it. A folded paper tucked beneath the windshield wiper. She reached out and unfolded it with fingers that were steadier than they should have been, because Evelyn had spent a lifetime receiving bad news with steady hands while everything inside her shook. One typed line. No signature, no date. The quarry is private property. Stay away. Evelyn read it twice. Then she folded it carefully, placed it inside the folder with the old map and Ada's notebook, and drove back toward the quarry. She did not speed. She did not cry. She had spent 42 years watching a man dismantle her life with documents. She had promised herself in that motel room that no piece of paper would ever again make her disappear without a fight. But that night, lying in the cabin in the dark, she listened to the quarry breathe around her and felt the particular loneliness of a woman who has just learned that the one place that accepted her without question might not be hers to keep. 3 keys sat on the walnut table now. The old house key, the rusted key from beneath the floorboard, and somewhere out there in the hands of someone she could not yet name, a 3rd key was turning, trying to unlock the only door Evelyn had left. Cal came the next evening with a sack of potatoes and the unhurried air of a man who had decided that looking after someone was simply part of his week now. Evelyn waited until he had set the potatoes on the counter before placing the map on the walnut table between them. Cal did not reach for it. He looked at the map the way a man looks at a grave he has not visited in a long time. Then he looked at the cabin walls, then back at the map. "You have seen this before," Evelyn said. Cal rubbed one thumb across the edge of the paper. "Not this exact one, but something like it." He was quiet long enough for the fire in the stove to pop twice. There were stories back when the quarry was closing. Folks said the cabin was not listed with the main quarry land. Said it had been separated years earlier, deeded to whoever kept watch out here. Who kept watch? Cal's voice dropped. Not the way voices drop when people are being dramatic. The way voices drop when they are carrying something that has waited a long time to be said, and the weight of it pulls the sound down before the words can reach full volume. Woman named Ada Weeks lived here from 43 onward, through the war, through the years after, through 2 ownership changes and a bankruptcy, and the slow forgetting that happens when the world decides a person's work is too quiet to matter. She kept the equipment, checked the water, maintained the roads, fixed what broke. Did it alone mostly. Did it without anyone remembering to thank her. Evelyn's eyes moved to Ada's notebook on the table. Its leather cover dark and cracked. Its pencil entries faded but legible. The careful handwriting of a woman who had understood that if she did not record her own existence, no one else would. What happened to her? Cal did not answer immediately. He picked up the tin cup near the stove and turned it in his hands, the way people handle objects when their hands need something to hold that is not the truth they are about to speak. Then he set the cup down, and he told her, 30 years ago, the quarry closed. The company that owned it, the third company, by then decided the stone was not worth the cost. They sold the land to a holding group out of Richmond. The sale was supposed to be clean, whole property, no exceptions, no loose ends. But the cabin was a loose end. It had been separated on paper decades earlier, carved out by old Mr. Fenton himself when he first hired a caretaker and wanted to make sure whoever lived here had a deed to stand on, not just a handshake. That separation was real. It was documented. It meant the cabin and the spring and the strip of road to the gate did not belong to whoever bought the quarry. Ada Weeks was still living here, 73 years old, 30 years in this cabin, alone, keeping the place alive the way she had always kept it alive, not because anyone asked, but because she did not know how to watch something fall apart and do nothing. Cal's hands went still on the table. He looked at Evelyn the way a man looks at someone when he is about to hand them something heavy and knows they will feel the weight of it long after he lets go. I was the foreman, last foreman before they shut it down. The company told me to sign a document, a declaration that the cabin was part of the main quarry parcel, that there was no separation, no caretaker deed, that the whole property, including this cabin, transferred with the sale. His voice did not waver, but it thinned the way a wire thins when too much current passes through it for too long. I knew it was not true. I had seen the original papers. I knew what Mr. Fenton had set up. I knew Ada had a claim. But the company said if I did not sign, I would lose my pension. 30 years of work. My wife was sick. She needed things I could not pay for without that check." He paused. "So I signed, and Ada Weeks, a woman who had kept this quarry alive longer than most of the men who worked it, was told she had no legal right to the place she had lived in for 3 decades. She was removed, not violently. Nobody dragged her out. They just showed her the paper I had signed and told her the cabin was no longer hers. And Ada, she was not a woman who fought with lawyers. She was a woman who fought with wrenches and roofing nails and the kind of stubbornness that keeps a pump running through February. She did not know how to fight paper, so she left. The fire in the stove crackled. Somewhere outside, wind moved through the quarry, and the limestone walls caught the sound and held it the way a cathedral holds an echo, not amplifying it, just refusing to let it disappear. Evelyn looked at Cal. She looked at his hands, rough-scarred, capable, and she saw them suddenly for what they also were. The hands that had signed a document that erased a woman from the only home she had. The hands that had done to Ada Weeks what Gerald's hands had done to Evelyn Thornton. Different men, different decades. The same arithmetic. A woman's life weighed against a man's comfort and found lighter. She did not shout. She did not accuse. She simply looked at him with an expression Cal would carry for weeks afterward. Not anger, not even disappointment, but the particular weariness of a woman who has just discovered that the pattern she escaped is older and wider than she imagined. "You let them erase her." Cal met her eyes. He did not flinch. Men who have lived with their worst mistake for 30 years do not flinch when someone finally names it. They have already flinched 10,000 times in the dark. "Yes. Why are you telling me this now?" "Because you are standing in her kitchen. And I have spent 15 years coming back to this quarry trying to undo something that cannot be undone. I cannot give Ada back what I took. She passed 8 years ago in a county home in Farnham, alone. No family that I could find, but I kept this." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded letter. The paper was old, creased along lines that had been opened and refolded many times by hands that could not leave it alone. It was a letter from the quarry company dated 19 years earlier, addressed to a law firm in Richmond. A single paragraph acknowledged that the cabin parcel had been historically excluded from the main quarry property, and that the 1994 transfer documentation contained irregularities regarding the caretaker designation. It did not prove ownership, but it proved separation. And separation meant the cabin was not simply part of the quarry that someone could claim whole. Evelyn read the letter twice. Then she placed it inside her folder beside the old map and the typed threat and Ada's notebook. She tied the folder shut with the same kitchen string she had used the first time she carried it into the records office. Then she looked at Cal, and her voice was quiet, and it carried the particular weight of a woman deciding whether to let someone remain in her life after learning the shape of what they had done. "You watched them take everything from a woman who held this place together with her bare hands. You signed the paper that made it legal. And then you spent 15 years driving out here to stare at the building you helped empty. Cal said nothing. There was nothing to say that would make the sentence less true. Evelyn stood and walked to the cabin door. She opened it. The quarry spread out before her. In the last light, the limestone walls turning the color of old honey. The pools at the bottom catching the sky's reflection like dark mirrors laid flat on the earth. She did not ask him to leave. She simply held the door open, and the open door said everything her voice did not. That she needed time. That the man who had helped her learn to keep a fire alive had also helped extinguish someone else's. That trust, once it develops a crack, does not break all at once. It simply stops holding weight in the place where the crack runs, and everything balanced on that spot has to find new ground. Cal stood. He picked up his cap. He walked to the door and stopped beside her. I cannot fix what I did to Ada, but I can make sure it does not happen to you. That letter is real. Those records exist. And whoever put that note on your windshield is counting on you being too afraid or too alone to find out what this land actually is. He stepped off the porch and walked to his truck. The engine started with its familiar complaint, and the headlights swept across the quarry walls as he turned, illuminating the old stone for a moment before the dark swallowed everything again. Evelyn closed the door. She sat at the walnut table with both hands flat on its surface, the way she always placed her hands when she needed to feel something solid beneath a conversation that might not hold. She stayed like that for a long time. Outside, the quarry settled into its nighttime language, the drip of water into stone, the creak of the cabin roof adjusting to the cold, the far-off sound of something moving through the trees that could have been wind, or could have been the kind of restlessness that lives in places where old debts have not been paid. Evelyn thought about Ada Weeks, a woman she had never met, a woman who had lived in this same room, slept near this same stove, walked the same spring path behind the cabin, a woman who had kept this place alive through a war, through a bankruptcy, through decades of silence, and who had been removed by a single signature on a single piece of paper because a man she probably trusted decided his pension mattered more than her home. She thought about the notebook, Ada's careful entries, the weather, the water levels, the equipment checks, all of it recorded in pencil by a hand that understood something Evelyn was only now beginning to learn, that a woman who keeps records of her own work is a woman who cannot be quietly erased. And she thought about Gerald, about the power of attorney she had signed in their kitchen on a Tuesday while dinner cooked and life moved at the speed it always moved, too fast to read the fine print, too ordinary to suspect that ordinary was the disguise betrayal wore best. 2 women, 2 kitchens, 2 signatures that changed everything. Separated by decades, but connected by the same thread, the quiet, devastating efficiency with which a woman's labor can be turned into a man's leverage. Evelyn pulled her own notebook from the shelf above the stove. She had started it during her first week in the cabin, a small spiral-bound book with a blue cover, the kind sold near checkout counters for $1.99. She had been writing in it each night, not a diary, not feelings, records, the date she arrived, the repairs she made listed by week with receipts saved in a manila envelope behind the stove, the names of people in Briar Creek who had brought her furniture to restore, the measurements of the boards she replaced on the porch, the hours she spent clearing the quarry road of fallen branches after the October storm so that Cal's truck could pass. The morning she found the spring path behind the cabin and cleared it of deadfall until clean water ran again for the first time in years. She had started the notebook as a habit, something to do in the quiet hours when the cabin was dark, and her hands needed a task smaller than carpentry. But now, sitting at the walnut table with Ada's notebook on one side and her own on the other, Evelyn understood that she had been doing something more important than habit. She had been building evidence, not of ownership, of presence, of work, of the 1,000 invisible hours a woman pours into a place that would fall apart without her. She opened to a fresh page and began writing everything she could prove. By the time the stove burned low and the cabin temperature dropped enough to see her breath in the lamplight, she had filled 4 pages. Dates, repairs, receipts, names. The precise measurements of every board she had replaced, every joint she had reinforced, every hour she had spent turning a forgotten building into something that could hold a woman's weight through winter. She closed the notebook and placed it beside Ada's. 2 notebooks, 2 women, 60 years apart, both writing in the same cabin, both proving the same thing, that they had been here, that they had worked, that the work mattered, and that if anyone tried to erase them, there would be a record. The next evening, Evelyn did something she had been postponing since the night she left the motel. She dialed Brennan's number. It was a Tuesday. The quarry was quiet. The light through the cabin window had turned the color of honey left too long in the jar. She sat at the walnut table with her hands flat on the surface, steadying herself the way a person steadies a boat before stepping off the dock into water whose depth they cannot see. Brennan answered on the second ring. His voice carried the sound of dinner being cleared in another room. A glass set down. A child's voice asking something she could not hear. The ordinary music of a life happening at full speed. She had called him every Sunday for a year and told him she was fine. She had said it so many times the words had worn smooth like a stone in a river that no longer resembles the rock it started as. This time, she did not say it. She told him about the motel, about the boxes in the Buick, about the weeks of libraries and parking lots and bread marked down near closing. She told him about the quarry and the cabin and the stove that nearly killed her and the old man who showed her how to keep a fire alive. She told him about the table, about Dottie, about the card in the window with her name on it. She told him about the documents she had found Gerald's hidden properties, the power of attorney she had signed without reading the way her financial life had been quietly dismantled while she was still planting tomatoes in a garden she believed was hers. She did not tell him everything. No mother hands over every wound at once, but she told him enough. The silence on the other end lasted long enough for Evelyn to hear her son's breathing change. The sound a person makes when the air in their chest becomes heavier than the air in the room. When Brennan finally spoke, his voice had dropped to the register. Men fall into when they are trying very hard not to cry in a room where someone might hear. "Mom, why didn't you call me?" Evelyn looked at the cabin walls, at the boards she had braced, at the window she had sealed, at the stove she had learned to feed, at the walnut table beneath her hands, scarred and honest and standing. Her voice came soft, almost a whisper, because it was not a defense or an explanation. It was the truest thing she had said in a year. Because I needed to know I could stand up before I asked anyone to help me stay standing. The line was quiet for a long time after that. Not empty quiet, full quiet. The kind of quiet that happens when two people are holding the same weight from opposite ends of a phone line and neither one wants to be the first to set it down, because setting it down might mean admitting how heavy it has been. Brennan spoke again. His voice was steady now, not because the emotion had passed, but because he had done what men of his generation do. With overwhelming feeling, he had pressed it into something useful. "I am coming. Tell me how to find you." Evelyn gave him the directions. The thin gray road east of Briar Creek, the rusted gate, the quarry that appeared all at once the way wounds do. Then she hung up and sat in the cabin for a long time, holding the phone in both hands, feeling the strange warmth of a conversation that had cost her a year of silence to begin and 3 minutes of honesty to complete. She did not feel relief. Relief was what people felt when danger passed. The danger had not passed. The note was still in her folder. The county records still held questions she could not answer. And somewhere beyond the quarry, someone was still looking at this land with the particular focus of a person who believes that what they want matters more than who is already standing on it. But something had shifted. Not in the cabin, not in the quarry, in Evelyn. She had spoken the truth to her son, and the truth had not destroyed either of them. It had not turned her into the emergency she feared becoming. It had not made Brennan's voice go careful and distant the way voices go when people are already planning how to manage you. It had simply moved between them like clean water, and both of them were still standing. 3 days passed. The quarry settled into its autumn rhythm. Evelyn worked on a set of shelves a farmer's wife had brought from a barn near the county line. Old pine planks, warped but solid, with hand-forged nails that told her the shelves were older than anyone currently living in Briar Creek. She pulled the nails carefully, straightened them, saved them in a jar on the walnut table, because a woman who has learned the value of things does not throw away what still works simply because it is bent. On the third afternoon, Dottie's voice came through Cal's phone with the particular sharpness of a woman delivering information she knows will land hard. Cal handed the phone to Evelyn without speaking. His face had already told her what his voice had not. "A man came into the diner this morning," Dottie said. "Asked about the woman who restores furniture." "Not the furniture?" "The woman." Evelyn's hand tightened on the phone. He left a business card on the counter beside his coffee cup. "I picked it up after he left." Dottie paused, and in that pause, Evelyn heard the sound of a woman choosing her words with the same care Evelyn used when choosing where to place a chisel precisely because the wrong angle ruins everything. The name on the card was Gerald Thornton, Real Estate Consultation. Evelyn heard the name. She felt it land inside her chest the way a stone lands in still water, not with violence, with the slow certainty of something heavy finding the bottom. But it was not the name that stopped her breathing. It was the line beneath it. Consulting for Garrett and Associates. Tom Garrett. Evelyn knew that name. Everyone in the county knew that name. Tom Garrett was the senior property attorney in the county assessor's office. He had handled land transfers, zoning disputes, and deed verifications for 20 years. He was the man whose signature appeared on every official property document filed in the county. He was also Gerald's college roommate, best man at their wedding, the man who had stood in a church in Lexington 38 years ago and raised a glass to the happy couple with a toast. Evelyn could still remember something about building a life on solid ground. Now he was handling the quarry's paperwork, and Gerald was consulting for him. Evelyn lowered the phone slowly. Cal watched her face the way a man watches a barometer when the needle moves in a direction he hoped it would not. Gerald was not here because he missed her. He was not here because guilt had finally caught up with him the way it catches up with men in stories conveniently dramatically at exactly the moment when the audience needs to see remorse. Gerald was here because there was a deal. There was always a deal. Gerald's entire life was a series of deals dressed in the language of concern. And Evelyn, who had spent 42 years translating that language without realizing she was doing it, could suddenly read it the way she read wood grain, clearly without illusion, and with the steady hands of a woman who has learned that seeing the truth is less painful than decorating the lie. Gerald had not come looking for his ex-wife. He had come looking for an obstacle. And Evelyn Thornton, standing in a quarry cabin with sawdust on her sleeves and a folder full of evidence tied with kitchen string, was exactly that. She set the phone on the walnut table. She looked at Cal. "Tell Dottie one thing." Cal waited. "Do not give him the quarry road." Dottie did not. But small towns are made of patterns, and Gerald had spent his career reading patterns the way Evelyn read grain. He returned to Marsh's Griddle twice more. He visited the hardware store and asked about an older woman buying hinges and roof sealant. He stopped at the flea market where a vendor remembered E. Thornton selling a restored side table from the back of an old Buick. No one pointed him toward the quarry road. But Gerald did not need a pointed finger. He only needed the shape of what people avoided saying. And he had always been fluent in the architecture of silence. That night, Evelyn did not sleep. She lay in the narrow bed and listened to the quarry, the way a woman listens to a house she is not sure will be hers by morning. Every sound carried weight, the stove ticking as it cooled, wind pressing against the tarp she had nailed over the eastern seam, the tin pot catching its steady drip beneath the last leak she had not yet reached. The note sat on the walnut table beside the two keys and Ada's notebook and Evelyn's own blue notebook and the folder tied with kitchen string that now held everything she had gathered evidence records, memories proof. A small archive of resistance built by a woman who had learned at 67 that the most powerful thing she could do was simply refuse to be erased. She had been made to feel like a trespasser before. In her own kitchen when Gerald's calls grew quiet and his office door stayed closed. In her own home when the property appraiser walked the rooms she had painted and measured the floors she had kept clean and never once asked who lived there. In every motel lobby where she stood too long calculating whether she could afford another night or whether the math had finally run out of patience with her. She had survived all of that by being careful, by being quiet, by folding herself into smaller and smaller shapes until she fit inside whatever space was offered. But this time, Evelyn did not fold. She rose before dawn. She lit the stove with the steady hands Cal had taught her to trust. She boiled water and made coffee in the dented pot she had found in the cabinet and scrubbed clean during her first week. And she sat at the walnut table with both notebooks open, Ada's and her own, and she read them side by side. Two women. Two sets of records. Two lives poured into the same cabin, the same walls, the same stubborn piece of ground that the world kept trying to take, and that kept being held by hands the world kept trying to ignore. Evelyn closed both notebooks. She placed them together in the folder. She tied the string. Then she pulled on her work gloves and walked outside to the porch she had rebuilt with her own hands, and she stood in the cold morning air and looked at the quarry the way a woman looks at something she has decided to keep, not because it was given to her, because she had earned it, board by board, nail by nail, scar by scar. And somewhere beyond the tree line, past the rusted gate and the thin gray road, a man named Gerald Thornton was driving toward Briar Creek with a surveyor's map on the passenger seat and the quiet confidence of a man who believed he already knew how this story ended. He was wrong, but he did not know that yet. For now there was only Evelyn, the coffee in her hands, the quarry breathing around her, the cabin standing behind her scarred and patched and holding the way she was holding, the way Ada had held before her, the way women hold when the world tells them to let go, and they look at the world and they look at what they are holding and they choose the weight. Brennan arrived 4 days later in a rented SUV that looked too clean for the quarry road. He parked beside the Buick and sat in the driver's seat for a long time before stepping out. Evelyn watched from the porch the way she had once watched him walk to school, knowing she could not carry him and could not stop him and could only wait to see what his face would tell her when he turned around. He turned around. He saw the cabin, the patched roof, the stacked firewood beneath its tarp, the garden behind a fence of reclaimed boards where late-season greens still held against the cold. The workbench beside the porch with a half-finished drawer front clamped to its surface, the repaired steps, the sealed windows, and his mother standing in a heavy sweater and work gloves with sawdust in the creases of her knuckles, looking at him with the steady expression of a woman who had rehearsed this moment 100 times in the dark and still did not know which version of herself would show up when the moment arrived. His face changed slowly. Not pity. Evelyn had been afraid of pity the way some people are afraid of heights, not because of the fall, but because of the moment before the fall, when the ground looks so far away that standing feels like a lie. But what she saw in her son's face was not pity. It was the particular grief that arrives when love recognizes how late it came. The slow widening understanding that the woman he had spoken to every Sunday, the woman who said, "I am doing all right, sweetheart," with a voice so steady it never once trembled, had been standing in a quarry in the cold alone, fixing a cabin with her bare hands, while he asked how she was, and believed the answer because believing was easier than listening. Brennan crossed the quarry ground. His shoes were wrong for the terrain. His coat was too thin for the wind that cut through the limestone walls in late autumn. He walked the way men walk when they are trying to keep their composure, and their composure is losing. He wrapped his arms around his mother, and Evelyn let him. For the first time in over a year, she allowed someone to hold her without pretending she did not need to be held. She pressed her face into his shoulder and breathed in the smell of his coat rental car, air freshener, and airport coffee. And something underneath that was still the boy who used to fall asleep on her lap while she read to him, his small hand gripping the edge of the blanket, with the absolute certainty that the voice above him would not stop until the story was done. The sound she made was not crying exactly. It was the sound a door makes when it finally opens after being sealed shut so long that even the hinges have forgotten which way they swing. They stood like that in the quarry while the wind moved around them, and neither one spoke because some silences are not empty. Some silences are the sound of two people agreeing without words that the distance between them was never about miles. Later inside the cabin, Brennan sat at the walnut table and ran his hand across its surface. He did not comment on the scars. He did not ask why the marks had been left. He simply touched the wood the way his mother had touched it on her first night, and Evelyn saw his fingers slow at the place where the deepest gouge ran along the edge, and she knew he understood. Not because she explained it, because understanding is sometimes inherited, passed down, not through words, but through the particular way a family's hands move when they encounter something that has survived damage without pretending the damage did not happen. She showed him the folder, The divorce documents, the hidden properties, the power of attorney from 2016, Ada's notebook, the quarry map, the company letter Cal had kept for 19 years, the typed threat from her windshield, her own blue notebook with its 4 pages of dated records. Brennan read everything. He read the way his mother sanded wood slowly, carefully, missing nothing. When he finished, he closed the folder and looked at her with an expression she had not seen on his face since he was 12 years old and had come home from school after learning that the world contained injustices too large for a child's vocabulary, but not too large for a child's sense of right and wrong. He did not ask what she wanted to do. He asked what she needed. And Evelyn, who had spent 42 years anticipating other people's needs and never once being asked about her own, felt something shift inside her chest. Not relief. Something sturdier than relief. The feeling of being seen by someone who was not looking at her through the lens of what she could do for them, but through the clear glass of who she actually was. "I need this to be organized," she said. "Dates, documents, every repair, every receipt, every name. I need it in order. Because whoever is coming for this land is going to come with lawyers and signatures and the kind of confidence that men carry when they believe paperwork is the same as truth. And I need to be ready." Brennan nodded. He opened his laptop on the walnut table beside Ada's notebook, and the 2 objects sat together, one from 1943, one from the present, like a conversation between 2 centuries about the same unanswered question. Who has the right to stay in a place they have kept alive with their own hands? For 3 days, Brennan organized everything. He photographed each page of Ada's notebook. He cross-referenced Evelyn's repair logs with the receipts in the manila envelope. He called the county assessor's office and requested copies of every filing related to the Fenton Quarry parcel since 1952. He found a property attorney in Farnham, not Tom Garrett, not anyone connected to Garrett, and scheduled a consultation for the following week. And each evening after the laptop was closed and the fire in the stove had burned low enough to turn the cabin the color of old amber, Brennan sat on the porch with his mother and listened to the quarry settle into darkness. And he did not try to fix her. He did not offer to take her back to Oregon. He did not suggest that the cabin was too small, or the quarry too remote, or the fight too difficult for a woman her age. He simply sat beside her and let the silence do what silence does best, when 2 people trust each other enough to share it. He let it hold them both without asking either one to fill it. On the 4th morning, Cal arrived with coffee in a thermos and a look on his face that told Evelyn he had not slept. He parked his truck beside the Buick and the rental SUV and stood for a moment, looking at the 3 vehicles lined up in the quarry the way a man looks at a formation he did not expect. Brennan walked out to meet him. The 2 men shook hands. Cal's grip was firm and brief, the way men of his generation shake hands, not performing, just confirming. Evelyn watched them from the porch. 2 men standing in the quarry where her life had been reassembled, connected only by her. One had failed a woman like her 30 years ago. The other had failed to see his own mother disappearing for a year. And now both of them were here, not because they could undo what they had done, but because they had decided that standing beside her while she fought was the nearest thing to atonement their hands could reach. Cal came to the porch. His voice was lower than usual. Dottie called this morning. He is back in town, asking about the quarry road this time, asking at the gas station, at the feed store, getting closer. Evelyn looked at the quarry walls. The limestone had caught the early light and turned the color of warm bread. A hawk circled above the far ridge, riding a current that was invisible from the ground but real enough to hold its weight. Then let him come, she said. And Gerald came. He came on a morning when the light was flat and the air smelled of cold stone and the last oak leaves rotting at the tree line. His car appeared at the rusted gate and moved slowly down the service road with the cautious pace of a man who was not accustomed to roads without center lines. Evelyn knew it was him before she could see the driver's face, because she had spent 4 decades learning the rhythm of his arrivals. The particular hesitation of a man who always paused before entering a room to calculate how he would be received. She was sanding a cabinet door across 2 sawhorses when he stepped out. Brennan stood near the woodpile. Cal sat on the porch with a cup of coffee. Dottie's car was parked beyond the Buick because Cal had called her that morning, and the people who had helped Evelyn build this life were not going to let her face its dismantling alone. Gerald stopped several feet from the porch. For a moment, he looked at the cabin the way a man looks at a math problem that has produced an answer he did not expect. His eyes moved across the patched roof, the stacked firewood, the garden fence, the workbench, the tools organized by size on a rack Evelyn had built from reclaimed lumber. He looked at all of it with the particular confusion of a man who had left behind something he considered broken and had returned to find it standing. He had followed the trail to Briar Creek, carrying a feeling he had mistaken for concern, but that Evelyn recognized immediately as something else. He had come expecting ruin. He had expected to find a woman frightened enough to need him, lonely enough to forgive him, broken enough to make his guilt feel useful. Instead, he found a porch that did not sag, a stove that kept a cabin warm through October nights, a table restored by hands that had once folded his shirts and were now capable of things he had never given them room to become. And Evelyn standing in the quarry light with sawdust on her sleeves and a steadiness in her posture that he had never seen in 42 years of marriage, because he had never given it room to exist. His voice sounded smaller than he intended. Evelyn. She set the sandpaper down. She removed her gloves 1 finger at a time, the way she did everything now, with patience, without hurry, without the need to make anyone else comfortable before she was ready. Gerald. There was no welcome in her voice. But there was no performance of pain either, and that unsettled him more than anger would have, because anger is a door that can be opened, and Evelyn had not left him a door at all. He looked around the quarry. You did all this. Not all at once. The answer was quiet, but it carried every cold morning and every bent nail and every night she had lain in the dark, wondering whether the woman she used to be was gone forever or only sleeping. It carried the weight of the table and the stove and the porch boards and the spring path and the $80 and the name on the card in the window and the 4 pages of notes and the 2 keys on the table and the years, the decades of work she had done for him that he had called ordinary until he no longer had access to it. Gerald's eyes moved to the walnut table visible through the cabin window. Its surface caught the light from outside and held it the way dark water holds a reflection, not brightly, but deeply. The table at the diner, the one Dottie had, that was yours. Yes, I recognized it. Evelyn met his eyes. You recognized the work. The correction was gentle, but Gerald felt it the way wood feels the chisel precisely in the place where the grain is weakest. Because there was a difference between recognizing what a woman's hands could do and recognizing the woman those hands belonged to. And Gerald had spent 42 years confusing the two. He shifted his weight. He looked at Brennan, who stood near the woodpile with his arms crossed and his face carrying the controlled stillness of a man who was allowing his mother to handle this, but had positioned himself close enough to intervene if the conversation turned in a direction he would not permit. He looked at Cal on the porch, whose expression offered nothing, not hostility, not sympathy, just the flat attention of a man who has seen what happens when women are underestimated and has decided never to make that mistake again. He looked back at Evelyn. I can help. With money, with the legal work, with whatever you need. Evelyn studied him. She studied him the way she studied a piece of wood before deciding where to cut, not with emotion, but with the patient clarity of someone who needs to understand the grain before committing the blade. She knew this man. She knew the way he arranged his face when he wanted something to look like generosity. She knew the angle of his shoulders when he was performing concern. She had watched him stand in open houses for 4 decades, turning his body toward clients the way a plant turns toward light. Not because the light mattered to him, but because facing it was how the deal got done. And she knew with the certainty of a woman who had finally learned to read the documents before signing them that Gerald had not come to this quarry to help her. Gerald, why are you really here? His face changed, not dramatically, the way a crack appears in plaster slowly following a line of weakness that was always there, just hidden beneath the surface. He began to speak, stopped, tried again, and Evelyn watched the machinery of his composure work through its gears, the calculation, the adjustment, the brief search for the angle that would make the truth sound like something other than what it was. But the quarry did not offer him a stage. It offered only stone and silence and a woman who was no longer available for the performance. Tom Garrett called me, Gerald said finally. His voice had lost its polish. Underneath it sounded tired. not the tiredness of a man who has been driving all morning. The tiredness of a man who has been carrying a lie for several months and has just realized that the person he is lying to can see it sitting on his shoulder like a bird that will not fly away. He asked me to consult on a property assessment, a development opportunity east of Briar Creek. I did not know it was the quarry until I saw the survey maps. I did not know you were here until I heard about the furniture. He paused. The note on your windshield, that came from Garrett's office. He sent it through a property service. Standard intimidation letter, the kind they send to clear squatters before a deal closes. I did not write it. I did not ask him to send it, but I knew about it. He told me after the fact, and I did not tell him to stop. Evelyn absorbed this. She absorbed it the way the limestone walls absorbed rain, without expression, without resistance, letting it run down the surface until it reached the ground and pooled in places where the stone had been worn thin by decades of weather. Gerald had not written the note, but he had known about it. He had known that someone was trying to frighten his ex-wife off a piece of land, and he had done what he always did. He had let someone else hold the pen. Let someone else sign the document. Let someone else deliver the damage. And then he had stood at a comfortable distance, hands clean, face concerned, offering help as if he had not been part of the machinery that made the help necessary. It was the April date all over again. It was the power of attorney all over again. It was the moving company he hired while she was at the doctor. The same pattern, the same man, the same quiet, methodical displacement of a woman's life performed through intermediaries so that Gerald could look in the mirror each morning and see concern instead of complicity. Evelyn looked at him for a long time. The quarry held its breath. The wind paused. Even the drip inside the cabin seemed to wait. His voice cracked at the center. Not dramatically. The way a beam cracks when the weight it carries has finally exceeded what it was built to hold. I am sorry. Evelyn did not look away. I believe you are. I made a mistake. Her voice came without cruelty, which made it impossible to deflect. No, a mistake is forgetting a birthday. A mistake is taking a wrong turn on a road you have driven 100 times. What you did had dates, papers, signatures. It had a woman's name I had to learn from a phone screen in my own hallway. And now it has a note on my windshield from a man you play golf with, trying to take the only place I have left. None of that is a mistake, Gerald. A mistake is something that happens to you. This is something you did. Gerald lowered his eyes. There was nowhere to put the truth she had just handed him. It simply stood between them the way the walnut table stood inside the cabin, scarred visible and refusing to be hidden. I can help, he said again. With money, with the legal work. Evelyn looked at the porch she had braced with her own hands, the wood pile she had stacked through the first frost. The cabinet door clamped to the sawhorses, half finished, waiting for her to return. Then she looked back at the man she had loved for 42 years and quietly released for the past one. Her words were not cold. They were not triumphant. They were simply true. I know how to repair things now. Gerald nodded once, and somewhere behind his eyes, in the place where men keep the things they understand too late, he saw the sentence for what it was. Not a rejection, a fact. The woman he had left behind no longer existed. Not because she had hardened, because she had finally become whole. He stood outside the circle of warmth that had formed around Evelyn in this quarry cow on the porch. Dottie standing near the doorway, Brennan beside the woodpile. 4 people and a cabin and a table and a fire in a stove that Evelyn had learned to keep alive. A circle built not from obligation, but from the slow accumulation of trust, the way a table is built from joints and grain, and the patient repetition of hands that refuse to quit. No one invited Gerald in, not because they were cruel, because the circle was full. Gerald stood in the quarry for another moment. He looked at the cabin. He looked at the limestone walls rising around him. He looked at the sky, which had turned the color of old pewter above the ridge line. Then he walked back to his car, and the engine started, and the sound retreated down the quarry road until the trees swallowed it, and the silence returned, filling the space Gerald had occupied, the way water fills a hole dug in wet sand completely, as if nothing had been there at all. Evelyn stood in the quiet. She did not watch his car disappear. She picked up her sandpaper and returned to the cabinet door on the sawhorses because the grain still needed following and the oil still needed applying. And the morning was not going to wait for her to decide how she felt about a man who had taken 42 years to become someone she could see clearly, and 3 minutes to become someone she could let go. The county hearing took place on a Tuesday in early December. The room was small, fluorescent lights, a long table at the front where 2 county commissioners sat with folders open and reading glasses perched at various angles of concentration. A clerk with a laptop, an American flag in the corner, its fabric slightly faded near the top, where sunlight from the window touched it every afternoon. Evelyn wore her best sweater, the same one she had worn to the records office on her first visit. Her hands were clean, but the calluses remained, and the thin scar across her left thumb caught the light when she placed her folder on the table, and she did not hide it. She had stopped hiding the evidence of her own work. Brennan sat beside her with a binder he had assembled over 3 weeks. Every document organized by date. Every receipt cross-referenced with a repair log entry. Every photograph of Ada's notebook printed and labeled. The company letter Cal had kept for 19 years now notarized. A timeline that began in 1943 with Ada Weeks arriving at the quarry and ended in the present with Evelyn Thornton standing in the same cabin doing the same work for the same reason, because the place needed someone, and she was someone who needed a place. On the other side of the room sat Tom Garrett. Evelyn had not seen him before. He was younger than she expected. Mid-50s. A suit that fit well enough to suggest money, but not so well that it suggested vanity. A leather briefcase. A legal pad with notes written in handwriting, so controlled it looked like it had been produced by a man who believed penmanship was a form of authority. Beside Garrett sat a representative from the holding company that had purchased the quarry land 30 years ago. The same company that had told Cal to sign the document that erased Ada Weeks from the property records. The representative was a woman in her 40s with a tablet computer and the particular expression of a person who had been sent to manage a problem that was supposed to have been resolved by a letter on a windshield. Evelyn presented her case the way she restored furniture, slowly, carefully, without erasing the scars. She began with Ada Weeks. She read from the notebook. Not the private entries, not the grief, not the November evening when Ada had learned her husband was not coming home. She read the records, the equipment checks, the water levels, the road maintenance logs. 50 years of a woman's labor recorded in pencil by a hand that understood that if you do not write down your own work, the world will pretend it never happened. She presented the map, the caretaker parcel drawn in black pencil by a hand that pressed hard enough to leave grooves. She presented the company letter acknowledging the cabin's separation from the main quarry land. Then she presented her own records, her blue notebook. 4 pages that had become 40. Every board she had replaced. Every joint she had repaired. Every hour she had spent clearing the road, restoring the spring, stacking firewood, sealing windows, bracing walls. The names of every person in Briar Creek who had brought her furniture to restore. The receipts, the dates, the measurements. A woman who keeps records of her own work is a woman who cannot be quietly erased. Evelyn had learned that from Ada. And now, in a county hearing room under fluorescent lights, she was proving it. Cal testified. He walked to the front of the room with the slow, deliberate gait of a man who had been carrying something for 30 years and had finally found the place to set it down. He removed his cap. He held it in both hands in front of him, the way men hold hats at funerals, not because the hat matters, but because the hands need something to grip when the body wants to run and the conscience says, stay. He told the room what he had told Evelyn. The closing of the quarry, the company's demand, the document he had signed declaring the cabin part of the main property, the pension he had protected, the woman he had displaced. He did not make excuses. He did not explain the context of his wife's illness, though Evelyn knew he could have. He did not ask for understanding. He simply stated what he had done in the flat, undecorated language of a man who has rehearsed a confession so many times in the dark that the words have lost their sharp edges and become smooth like stones in a creek bed, worn down by the current of years. I signed a document I knew was false, he said, and a woman who had kept that quarry alive for 30 years was removed from her home because of my signature. The room was quiet. The commissioner's pen stopped moving. The clerk's fingers hovered above the keyboard. Cal looked at Evelyn. I cannot undo what I did to Ada Weeks, but I can tell the truth about it now. The cabin was never part of the main quarry land. The separation was real. My signature did not change the fact. It only hid it. He returned to his seat. His hands were shaking. Not visibly, not in a way the room could see. But Evelyn saw it because she had spent a year learning to notice the small tremors that pass through people when they have just let go of something they have been holding too long. Then Brennan stood. He had spent 3 days at the county assessor's office requesting records, cross-checking filings following a trail of paperwork that led from the original 1952 Fenton deed through 3 ownership transfers and a bankruptcy and a closing and a sale, 30 years of documents stacked on top of each other, like sediment, each layer obscuring the one beneath it. And at the bottom of that sediment, buried beneath decades of transfers and filings and the accumulated weight of bureaucratic indifference, Brennan had found something. Tom Garrett's filing. 3 years ago, when the holding company first began exploring the possibility of selling the quarry land to a developer, Garrett had been retained to prepare the property assessment. His job was straightforward: verify the boundaries, confirm the deed, clear any encumbrances that might complicate the sale. But the cabin was an encumbrance. The caretaker parcel was a complication. And Tom Garrett, a man who had built his career on the principle that complications are problems to be solved rather than truths to be honored, had solved this one the way Cal's company had solved it 30 years earlier. He had filed a consolidated property description with the county that listed the cabin as part of the main quarry parcel. He had omitted the 1952 separation. He had excluded the caretaker designation from the boundary survey. And he had done it knowing, because the original deed was in the county's own archive, accessible to anyone who looked, that the cabin had been legally separated from the quarry for over 70 years. Brennan laid the documents on the table. The original 1952 deed with the caretaker parcel clearly marked. Garrett's filing from 3 years ago with the same parcel absorbed into the main property as if it had never existed. 2 versions of the same land separated by 7 decades, connected by the same lie that what a woman kept alive could be taken by a man with a pen. The room shifted. Not physically. The chairs did not move. The fluorescent lights did not flicker. But the air changed the way air changes in a room when the people in it realize that the story they have been told is not the story that happened. Tom Garrett sat very still. His legal pad lay untouched. His pen rested on the table at a precise angle, and Evelyn noticed with the detached clarity that sometimes arrives in moments of confrontation that even his pen was controlled, placed rather than dropped, positioned rather than abandoned. A man who arranged his pen was a man who arranged everything, including property records. The commissioner asked Garrett to respond. Garrett spoke carefully. He used words like procedural consolidation and boundary rationalization and standard practice in multi-transfer properties. He spoke the way Gerald spoke at dinner parties, fluently, confidently, with the practiced ease of a man who believed that the right vocabulary could make any arrangement sound reasonable. But the original deed sat on the table, and Ada's notebook sat beside it. and Evelyn's records sat beside those. And the accumulated weight of evidence of two women's work recorded in pencil and in ink across 60 years and in the same cabin was heavier than vocabulary. The commissioner asked one question. Mr. Garrett, were you aware of the 1952 caretaker designation when you filed the consolidated property description? The room waited. Garrett's answer came after a pause that lasted long enough for everyone present to understand that the pause itself was the answer, and everything that followed would be decoration. The designation was ambiguous. The commissioner looked at the 1952 deed. The caretaker parcel was drawn in black ink. The boundaries were clear. The language was plain. There was nothing ambiguous about it except the decision to pretend it did not exist. The hearing adjourned for review. 3 weeks later, the county issued its determination. The caretaker parcel was recognized as a separate property. Evelyn's occupancy, her documented repairs, her sustained maintenance of the cabin and its grounds, and the historical evidence of Ada Weeks's prior caretaker status were accepted as the basis for a formal caretaker agreement. The cabin was hers, not because someone gave it to her, because she had done what Ada had done before her. She had kept it alive, and she had written it down, and she had refused to let a piece of paper tell her she did not exist. Tom Garrett's filing was referred to the state bar for review. The investigation would take months. It would be quiet. It would involve letters and depositions and the slow, methodical machinery of professional accountability. But it was real. And Gerald Thornton, whose name appeared on the property consultation that supported Garrett's assessment, was named as a cooperating party. The man who had used documents to dismantle his wife's life had been undone by documents. The man who had believed that signatures were tools of power had discovered that signatures are also records, permanent, traceable, honest, in a way that the men who sign them often are not. Evelyn did not celebrate. Celebration was for people who had won something. Evelyn had not won. She had simply refused to lose. And the difference between the two was the difference between a table that looks new and a table that looks honest. One is easier to admire, but the other is the one you trust to hold weight. She named her business Quarry Light Restorations. People brought her broken chairs, warped shelves, cabinets with doors that would not close, tables their grandmothers had eaten on and their children wanted to throw away. Evelyn took each one. She cleaned it. She repaired it. She rubbed oil into the wood until the grain remembered warmth. And she never once erased the scars. She only made them strong enough to carry the truth of where the wood had been. Dottie cleared a corner of Marcia's griddle for a small display. A card on each piece read, "Restored by E. Thornton," and beneath it, in smaller letters, "Quarry Light Restorations, Briar Creek." People drove from neighboring counties. A furniture dealer in Farnham asked to carry her work. A magazine that covered Appalachian craftsmanship called Dottie's number and asked for the woman who restored furniture without erasing the marks. Evelyn declined the magazine, not because she was modest, because she was busy. The rocking chair on the workbench needed its second coat of oil, and the church pew ends were waiting in the cabin, and a school teacher from Briar Creek had brought a child's desk that had been in her family for 4 generations and needed joints that would hold for a 5th. The work was enough. The work had always been enough. She had simply forgotten for 42 years that the work was hers. Gerald sent a letter months later. Evelyn read it beside the stove on an evening when the quarry was quiet and the fire was low and the light inside the cabin had the amber softness of something that has been earned rather than given. The letter was honest. More honest than anything Gerald had said in person, because written words do not have a face to arrange or a voice to modulate, and Gerald, stripped of his instruments of performance, had produced something that sounded for the first time like the man beneath the man she had married. He wrote about regret, not the regret of a man who is sorry he was caught, but the deeper, more corrosive regret of a man who is beginning to understand that the life he dismantled was the life that had sustained him, and that the woman he undervalued was the only person who had ever seen him clearly and chosen to stay anyway. Evelyn read the letter twice. It was honest enough to keep, but it was not powerful enough to reopen the door she had closed. She placed it in the drawer beneath the walnut table beside the old map and the oilcloth and the rusted key that had once belonged to Ada Weeks. Then she went back to work, because peace was not something Gerald could return to her after taking so much of it away. Peace was something Evelyn had built herself, the way she built everything now, with steady hands, with patient tools, with the understanding that broken things do not need to become new. They only need to become strong enough to stand. Cal came by on a Saturday in January with a new stovepipe brush and a tin of wood oil he said was left over from a project, but that Evelyn suspected he had driven 40 minutes to buy. He did not mention the hearing. He did not mention Garrett. He did not mention his own testimony or the way his hands had shaken afterward, or the 3 nights he had spent sitting in his kitchen with the lights off, wondering whether telling the truth had undone the damage or only made it visible. He simply checked the stovepipe, tested the draft, replaced a washer on the kitchen faucet that Evelyn had not yet noticed was dripping. And before he left, he stood on the porch and looked at the quarry the way he always did not, with ownership, not with guilt, but with the quiet attention of a man who has learned that watching over something is not the same as possessing it. "You did right by her," he said. Evelyn knew he was not talking about the hearing. He was talking about Ada. On the first morning of the 2nd year, Evelyn stood on the porch before sunrise with a cup of coffee warming both hands. The quarry was dark. The air smelled of cold limestone and damp leaves, and the faint sweetness of oak smoke drifting from the stovepipe she had learned to keep clear. Somewhere behind the cabin, the spring she had unclogged moved over stones with a sound like quiet conversation. Then the first light entered the quarry. It came slowly, the way important things do. It touched the far limestone wall and turned it gold. It crossed the quarry floor and found the stacked firewood, the garden fence, the workbench, where a rocking chair waited for its second coat of oil. It moved through the cabin window and fell across the walnut table, where 3 keys lay together in a row. The first key was small and ordinary and belonged to a house that no longer knew Evelyn's name. She had carried it for months after the locks were changed, because throwing it away felt like agreeing that 42 years could disappear into something that fit between coins at the bottom of a purse. She did not carry it anymore, but she kept it. Because forgetting is not the same as erasing, and Evelyn had learned the difference. The second key was heavy and dark with rust, and it had waited beneath the floorboards for decades, holding the memory of a woman named Ada Weeks, who had kept this cabin alive through a war and a bankruptcy, and the slow forgetting that happens when the world decides a person's work is too quiet to matter. No one had written Ada's name in a place that lasted. But the key had lasted, and now it sat on a table that Evelyn's hands had restored. And that was a kind of remembering that did not require ink. The third key was new. Evelyn had made it herself cut at the hardware store in Briar Creek from a blank she chose because its weight felt right in her palm. It opened the cabin door, which she had fitted with a proper lock during the first week of winter, and it hung on a nail beside the entrance where she could find it in the dark. 3 keys. 3 women, if she counted Ada and herself. 3 versions of the same quiet truth that a life does not have to be loud to be real, and a place does not have to be grand to be home, and the hands that repair what others discard are doing holy work, whether anyone sees them or not. The light reached Evelyn's hands. She looked down at them. They were not the hands she had brought to this quarry. Those hands had been smooth and uncertain, trained to hold other people's needs so long they had forgotten the shape of their own. These hands had calluses now. A thin scar across the left thumb from a chisel that slipped in October. Oil in the creases that never fully washed out. They were not beautiful in the way magazines photograph hands. They were beautiful in the way tools are beautiful, shaped by purpose, marked by use, honest about where they have been. The coffee warmed her palms. The quarry filled with light. The cabin behind her creaked softly the way it always did in the cold, and Evelyn no longer heard complaint in the sound. She heard conversation. The old wood talking to the morning, the stove remembering heat, the walnut table holding its scars beneath the window like a journal open to every page at once. Evelyn took a breath. The air tasted of stone and smoke, and the particular sweetness of a place that has been brought back from forgetting by someone who understood that the work itself was the answer. Not the money, not the recognition, not the approval of a man who had once held her life in his hands and set it down without checking whether it would break. The work, the patient, ordinary, sacred work of putting damaged things back together without pretending the damage never happened. She finished her coffee. She set the cup on the porch rail. She pulled on her work gloves and walked toward the rocking chair on the workbench because there was oil to apply and grain to follow and a morning that did not ask her to be anything other than exactly what she had become. Behind her, the 3 keys caught the light on the walnut table and held it.